Lesson 17 is the skeletal-muscular system, and so we're going to begin with the skeleton. So 17.1 is bone tissue. The skeleton functions in protection, so certainly protects soft underlying tissues, also support for other soft tissues. Movement, as we put skeletal muscle on bone, it can act as levers, and so we can move. Also mineral storage, especially calcium storage, very important function of the skeleton. And the bone marrow produces all of our blood cells. If we look at the microscopic anatomy of bone, there are two types of bone tissue. The first is compact bone. Compact bone is found on the outside of all bones. It's very hard and dense, strong, rigid material. It is made of highly organized units called an osteon. If you look in the diagram, you can see the bracket that's labeled osteon, and it's indicating a circular unit. And then right next to that, there's one that's kind of telescoped up. So these osteons are pillars of bone. They are made of concentric rings, the lamellae, and these rings are deposited around a central canal. There will be blood vessels inside that central canal, and then these various lamellae are deposited. The lamellae consist of collagen fibers, long collagen fibers, and then mineral salts are deposited in each of those. There are some little tiny openings between the lamellae. These are called lacuna, means little lake, and the actual living cell or osteocyte is found within the lacuna. Then there are also what are called perforating canals that connect the central canal of the various osteons, and so this is how we can get nutrients, remove waste, exchange gases with the osteocyte. The other type of bone is spongy bone. Spongy bone is found inside, in the interior of the bone, and this is a more open lattice work of bone tissue. The openings within spongy bone is where we typically will find the bone marrow deposits. We can also classify bone based on shape. A long bone basically is longer than it is wide. Flat bones are plates of compact bone, very thin plates with a little thin layer of spongy bone in between. A short bone is more equal in length versus width, certainly not square, but they are not long like the long bones. And then we have some others that are called irregular bones, such as the vertebra of the vertebral column. This is the anatomy of a typical long bone. This would be the humerus, the bone of the upper arm. The long shaft is called the diaphysis. This diaphysis is thick, compact bone, and then the ends of the bone is called the epiphysis. The epiphysis contains spongy bone in the middle, and then there is a thin plate of compact bone around the outside of the epiphysis, and there will be some hyaline cartilage on the end of the epiphysis, and this is to make a nice smooth surface for a joint. The diaphysis is hollow. That's called the medullary cavity, and in adults it typically contains yellow marrow, which is mainly fat. Red marrow is up inside the spongy bone, those openings of spongy bone up in the epiphysis. Whenever the skeleton is developing during fetal development, it begins first as a hyaline cartilage model, and then a specific cell called an osteoblast will invade that cartilage and start converting the cartilage to bone. This happens first in the center. This is called the primary ossification center, and then there are secondary ossification centers out in the epiphyses of the bone. So the osteoblast, as this cartilage is formed, the osteoblast then converts it into bone. Then there is another type of cell, an osteoclast, and the osteoclast breaks down bone. And so as the osteoblast makes bone, the osteoclast breaks it down, and so it's the combined activity of these that form and then mold and shape the individual bones. At birth, there is a band of cartilage that is still between the diaphysis and the epiphysis. This plate is called the growth plate, and this is the only place that bone can continue longitudinal growth. We will add cartilage cells on one side of the growth plate, and then the osteoblast will convert that cartilage into bone. And so what happens is the diaphysis grows, and it will push the epiphyses farther and farther apart, and that is the longitudinal growth in bone. Very soon after puberty, due to the influence of sex hormones, the growth plate will close. And this is because the function of the osteoblast increases, and the cartilage is converted into bone more rapidly than we can add additional cartilage. So essentially what happens is the epiphysis and the diaphysis will grow together, and at that point longitudinal growth stops. Circumferential growth can occur. We can make the bone bigger around and heavier by adding osteons to the outside of the bone. There's a membrane on the outside I failed to mention earlier called the periosteum. Peri means around, osteo refers to bone. So this little thin fibrous membrane on the outside is the periosteum, and there are osteoblasts beneath that periosteum, and they can continue to add osteons to the outside, and that's going to make the bone heavier, bigger around. Bone remodeling continues throughout life. We tend to think of bone as just some concrete architecture, but bone tissue is very dynamic, and it is constantly changing based on environmental stresses. And so this is called remodeling. And this is a tug of war between those two cells we've already mentioned. The osteoblast is constantly adding bone. The osteoclast is constantly breaking that down. So this process of remodeling continues really throughout life. If we put stress on bone, it will respond by becoming larger and stronger. This is also the process that occurs when we damage or break a bone. The osteoblast will secrete new bone around the break to fuse those pieces together. Then over time the osteoclast will break that down to reshape it. This is also very important in mineral homeostasis. If our specifically calcium concentration in the blood gets too low, then the osteoclast will break down bone tissue. That's going to release calcium into the blood. If we need to remove calcium from the blood, then the activity of the osteoblast will increase. So we can pull greater quantities of calcium from the blood and deposit that into hard bone tissue. Osteoporosis is a condition that occurs primarily in women, not exclusively. Men can get osteoporosis as well, but it's generally in females after menopause. At menopause, the sex hormones concentrations decline, and this causes the osteoblast activity to also decline, and the result is very weak, thin bones or porous bones.